Mist rolls down the spine of the hills like an old secret trying to find its way home. The trees are bare, their branches crooked like the fingers of time itself, reaching, warning, remembering. Somewhere deep in that valley, before roads cut through and names were written down, there lived a family whose world ended where the tree line began. Before Lorene Whittaker was born, before the cameras and the pity and the pointing fingers, there was a silence. Not the peace of quiet mornings, but the kind of silence that grows like mold, feeding on the things no one wants to say. They say the Whittakers came from settlers who once roamed the mountains free, but as the decades bled together, the world outside grew louder, and the Whittakers grew still. One by one, the men stopped leaving for work, the women stopped going to town, neighbors stopped visiting, and soon, no one knew if the family still lived there, or if the mountains had swallowed them whole. In these forgotten ridges of odd West Virginia, survival was its own religion. Hunger taught its prayers. Winter buried its dead. And when the world turned its back, the Whittakers turned inward, blood marrying blood, generation after generation, until the line itself became a loop. The elders said it started after a feud, a killing over land that was never worth dying for. Others whispered it was shame. A girl wronged, a boy accused, and a town too proud to forgive. Whatever the truth, the Whittakers built their own borders and guarded them not with fences, but with silence. That silence became inheritance, passed down like a name, like an illness, like a curse. And as the outside world moved into color, the Whittakers remained in black and white, shadows moving in fog, speaking in half words, praying to a god that forgot their road. The mountains remember what the people forget. And somewhere, in that hollow thick with ghosts and pine smoke, the first silence of the Whittaker bloodline still lingers, heavy as the mist, waiting for someone to listen. Slow pause. Where are you watching from tonight? Somewhere far from these hills, or close enough to feel their breath. Subscribe to Underbelly Bloodline, and together we'll trace the echoes of the silence that began it all. The year was somewhere between the wars. Time ran different in the holler. The outside world was roaring into modern life, but down in odd West Virginia, the clock still ticked by the rhythm of the mountains. Lorene Whittaker was just a girl then, barefoot, thin as a whisper, her hair tangled by the wind, and her heart already carrying secrets too heavy for a child. Her family's land was a patch of red clay and pine roots, hemmed in by the same hills that kept outsiders away. Poverty wasn't a word they used. It was the air they breathed. The house leaned like it was tired of standing, and the wood stove crackled with the sound of old prayers. In that place, love was survival, and survival demanded silence. Lorene's mama spoke of curses and blessings in the same breath. She'd say, "Blood's all we got, girl. You keep it close," and Lorene did. She learned that in these mountains, blood bound tighter than law, tighter than truth. Her kin didn't trust the world beyond the ridge, not the sheriff, not the preacher, not even the mailman who came twice a month with bills and pity in his eyes. At night, she'd clutch a rag doll sewn from her mother's apron and stare at the cracks in the cabin ceiling. Each creak felt like the house remembering something it shouldn't. She'd hear her parents arguing in the next room, voices low, sharp, then swallowed by the same silence that ruled the family. There were rumors, even then, of fights that turned bloody, of cousins marrying cousins to keep the land in the name. But to Lorene, it wasn't sin or scandal. It was life. It was the only map she'd ever been given. By the time she turned 16, Lorene knew that in the holler, love and shame wore the same face. A woman's worth was measured by how much she could endure and how little she spoke. And so she endured. Through hunger, through fear, through the long nights when the wind carried the sounds of fighting and crying, and something darker still. What Lorene didn't know then was that her silence would echo for generations, that the lessons she learned in that leaning cabin would become the backbone and the breaking point of the Whittaker bloodline. The years crept through the hollow like smoke through old timber, slow, bitter, and impossible to stop. Lorene Whittaker had grown from the girl by the fence into the matriarch of a house that time had forgotten. The outside world had moved on. Highways paved, towns grew electric. But up here in odd West Virginia, the only light came from kerosene and memory. She was the spine of that house. When the roof leaked, she patched it with flour sacks. When the cupboards went bare, She stretched one jar of beans into a week. The floorboards sagged, the children bickered, and the men disappeared for days. Yet Lorene stayed, always stayed. Every morning before dawn, she'd light the oil lamp and whisper a prayer into the smoke. Not a prayer for hope. She'd long stopped believing in miracles, but for the strength to make it through another day. Because in her world, survival was holiness. Her faith wasn't in the Bible on the shelf, but in her hands, rough, cracked, and always working. Lorene learned to hide the hunger from her children's eyes, to turn nothing into something, and to make silence sound like safety. When the yelling started in the next room, when fists slammed on the table and curses rattled the walls, she'd hum low hymns to drown it out. The neighbors never asked, and she never told. That was the rule. In the evenings, she'd sit by the window and watch the fog swallow the hills, remembering the faces that had already vanished. Brothers lost to drink, cousins who never came back, a husband whose rage was louder than any storm. And through it all, she kept the family together, thread by thread. The keeper of a bloodline that refused to die, no matter how much it hurt to live. They said she was strong. But strength in the mountains is just another word for endurance. And endurance for Lorene meant staying quiet while the world rotted behind her walls. She cooked from empty cupboards and prayed from an empty heart. A woman trying to hold back a flood with her bare hands. The house stood because she stood. But every prayer whispered in that dim light carried the weight of generations, and the fear that one day silence would no longer be enough. The Whittaker house sat deep in the hollow, a place where echoes went to die. Its windows were fogged with years of wood smoke, its walls stained with the weight of things never spoken. By the time Lorene Whittaker reached her middle years, the silence she'd learned as a child had hardened into law. A rule carved not in stone, but in fear. There were no written commandments here, no sermons from the pulpit, just a shared understanding. What happens in this house, dies in this house. Lorene never had to say it out loud. The looks, the pauses, the tightening of her jaw, that was enough. The children knew when to stop talking, the neighbors knew when to stop asking. Inside those thin wooden walls, the world was a mixture of love and dread. Dinner might be laughter one night and shouting the next. A slammed door, a child crying in the corner, the clatter of a bottle on the floor. And then the same suffocating quiet. The kind that presses against your chest until you can't tell whether it's the house breathing or you. Sometimes a bruise would bloom on a face and fade without mention. Sometimes a voice went missing for days. The family didn't call it abuse. They called it life. In the holler, people didn't go to the police. They went to prayer or to drink or to sleep. Anything that made the hours move faster. Lorene believed silence was protection, that if she kept the noise inside, it would never find its way out. But silence is a living thing, and it grows teeth. It turned her home into a confessional where no one forgave, where secrets multiplied like rot in the floorboards. The younger ones started whispering to each other, small rebellions in the dark. One day someone would leave, one day someone would tell. But nobody did. The hills were too high, and shame too heavy to carry beyond them. Lorene would watch them, eyes sharp, heart hollow, knowing the truth she could never say. The bloodline was eating itself alive. The rule that once kept them safe was now tearing them apart. By the time the 1970s rolled around, the town of Odd, West Virginia, had grown quiet. The mines were drying up, and the younger folks were leaving faster than the trains could carry them. But for the ones who stayed, stories were the only currency left, and no story was worth more than the Whittakers. At the dusty diner by the crossroads, you could hear it in the morning coffee talk, whispered between men with coal dust still on their knuckles. They say you can hear 'em howlin' up there at night. They ain't right, that bunch. Married kin, I heard. Laughter follows, but it's nervous, like they're afraid the hills might be listening. Lorene Whittaker never stepped foot in that diner. She knew her name was the salt in everyone's story, the ghost that gave their own lives meaning. For every man that lost a job, there was a Whittaker to point to. For every family that broke apart, there was theirs to whisper about. The holler became a boundary of myth and shame. Children were warned not to go near the Whittaker place. You'll come back cursed, they said. The more the world forgot the family, the bigger the legend became. It twisted like smoke through pine, impossible to grab, but impossible to ignore. The truth was simpler and sadder. They were just poor, isolated, bound by blood and circumstance. But rumor doesn't care for truth. Rumor feeds on hunger, envy, and fear. And the town of Odd was starving. Lorene's children heard the whispers too. At the general store, in church pews, from classmates who laughed and pointed. Each word carved a little deeper until pride turned to anger, and anger turned to retreat. The Whittakers stopped coming to town altogether. They built their own world, where outsiders didn't exist. And inside those hills, the family's name became both armor and curse. In Odd, stories spread faster than truth, and Lorene's family became the tale people told to feel lucky they weren't them. But every rumor carries a cost, and in the Whittaker Hollow, that cost was measured in blood and silence. Where are you watching from tonight? Have you ever known a town where a single name could haunt generations? Subscribe to Underbelly Bloodline and walk with us deeper into the mountains, where rumor ends and the truth begins. The 1980s came and went without ever touching the Hollow. While the rest of the world was learning to live loud, neon lights, big cities, new wealth, the Whittakers of Odd, West Virginia, lived the same way they had for 100 years, by the oil lamp, by the creek, by each other. By then, Lorene was old, her face carved like the mountains that held her, her voice soft but final, a woman who'd seen hunger, death, and betrayal, and learned to live alongside them. The world outside had taken everything it could from her family, their dignity, their reputation, their place in the valley. All that remained was blood. And blood, in the holler, meant survival. When you're forgotten by the world, when no one comes up the dirt road, when poverty stretches so long it becomes part of your name, you start clinging to what's left. For the Whittakers, that was kinship. A familiar face meant trust. A shared name meant safety. So, they married within. Not from wickedness or sin, but from desperation. A hope that maybe if they kept to their own, they could hold on to the last thread of who they were. But every thread pulled tighter makes the fabric weaker. It started subtle. Cousins marrying cousins, nephews courting nieces. At first, no one called it wrong. In the eyes of the family, it was simply keeping the line. They told themselves it was about love, about loyalty, about the old ways that once kept mountain families whole. But the walls were closing in, one generation at a time. As years passed, you could see it. In the eyes, the gait, the slow unraveling of health. The bloodline began folding over itself like paper, too many times creased. Outsiders would never understand. Insiders dared not speak. And so, the truth rotted in silence, buried beneath years of denial and devotion. Lorene sat by the fire one winter night, staring into the flames that cracked and whispered her family's secrets. She had held her kin together with her bare hands. But now, she was watching what the binding had become. They had kept the line alive, yes, but the cost was written in their flesh. They married within to keep the line alive, not knowing that the walls they built were closing in. The hollow was quiet that winter, the kind of quiet that hums beneath your ribs. Snow fell on tin roofs, muffling every sound but the wind that moaned through the pine. Deep inside that silence, 3 children grew, Betty, Ray, and Larry Whittaker. The last roots of a family too tangled to ever pull free. Their mother, Lorene, ruled with what she called love, though it often came with a switch or a silence sharp enough to draw blood. She'd seen too much to be soft. Her faith was stitched together with fear, her lessons carved from loss. And those children learned early. In this family, you didn't question, you didn't cry, and you sure as hell didn't tell. Betty, the eldest, carried her mother's eyes, weary before their time. She helped Lorene keep the house, sweeping floors that never stayed clean, feeding brothers from cupboards that echoed. Ray was quiet, watchful, his curiosity punished before it could bloom. Larry was the wild one, the one who laughed too loud, asked too much, wandered too far, always dragged back by Lorene's rough hand and the whisper, "You're one of us. Don't forget that." 2 outsiders, they were just poor mountain kids. But inside that cabin, generations of silence pressed down like fog. Lorene's rules weren't written, but everyone knew them. Don't speak of what happens here. Don't let outsiders in. Don't question the blood that binds you. The children grew up thinking this was love, the heavy kind that came with duty and dread. They learned to read the moods in Lorene's face the way others read scripture. They learned that hunger could be prayed away and that the world beyond the holler wasn't for people like them. When they laughed, it was quiet. When they played, it was behind closed doors. And when they dreamed, if they dreamed at all, it was of a life they couldn't even name. Because how do you dream of freedom when silence is your mother tongue? In time, the outside world would come knocking, with cameras, questions, and judgments. But before all that, before the world turned their pain into spectacle, they were just children, shaped by secrets, raised by fear, and bound by blood. They didn't just inherit Lorene's name, they inherited her ghosts. The holler had been quiet for decades, tucked away like a forgotten secret beneath layers of time and shame. But silence has a strange way of calling out, even when no one means for it to. And one day, the road that led into Odd, West Virginia, carried something the Whittakers had never known before: outsiders. It began with footsteps, not neighbors, not kin, but strangers carrying cameras and questions, wearing clothes too clean for this dirt. The air changed when they arrived. Dogs barked from behind rusted gates. Curtains shifted in the cabins. The people who once feared the world now became its subject. For years, Lorene's word had been law. Don't let outsiders in. But Lorene was gone now, her prayers fading in the dust. What she left behind was a family unprepared for the gaze of the modern world, unguarded, raw, and unaware of what was coming. The first camera flickered on, its red light glowing like an unholy eye. And in that moment, the Whittakers' world split in two, before and after. The before was silence, stillness, and shame. The after was noise, light, and the hungry eyes of millions who would soon watch, judge, and whisper. They didn't see the pain, only the spectacle. They didn't hear the echo of Lorene's rules, only the broken speech that decades of isolation had carved into their tongues. They came for curiosity, for shock, for the kind of fascination that turns human suffering into folklore. Ray looked toward the lens like it was something from another world, suspicious but unable to look away. Betty, older now, seemed to shrink in its presence, her face caught between confusion and exhaustion. And in those quiet frames, the world saw tragedy. But for the Whittakers, it was simply life. Their life, as it had always been. The mountains that once hid them had now betrayed them. Their story, once whispered in diners and gas stations, became public property. The same silence that had protected them for generations now made them vulnerable to the world's loudest voices. And just like that, the isolation that had been their curse became their claim to fame, their home, a museum, their pain, a headline. As night fell over the hollow, the lights of the outsiders' vehicles faded into the distance, leaving behind a quiet heavier than before. The Whittakers didn't yet understand that what had just begun could never be undone. The silence that once kept them safe now made them a spectacle. The hills around Odd grew quieter with each passing year, the kind of quiet that follows after too much loss. The Whittaker cabin stood like a ghost itself now, weather-beaten, leaning under the weight of time and memory. Inside, the laughter that once echoed faintly through its rooms had vanished. All that remained was the soft shuffle of feet and the groan of the old floorboards beneath a bloodline that was wearing thin. Lorene's rules had held the family together once: silence, loyalty, endurance. They had survived hunger, ridicule, and shame by keeping the world out. But rules meant to protect can also become prisons. And by the time her children were grown, those walls had started to close in. Betty's eyes carried the exhaustion of generations. She moved slower now, her body worn from both labor and loss. Ray grew distant, his mind wandering further than his feet ever could. Larry, restless and fragile, tried to find meaning in the ruins of what was left, each of them haunted by echoes of Lorene's voice. Family first. Always family. But what happens when the family itself becomes the wound? One by one, sickness crept in, the kind that doesn't just eat at flesh, but at the spirit. Some say it was genetic, the cost of too many shared roots. Others whisper it was punishment, the mountain reclaiming what man should have never held. Whatever it was, the Whittakers began to fade, their once-bound souls unraveling thread by thread. Neighbors in town spoke of seeing Betty less, of hearing cries in the night carried down the ridge by the wind, of the smell of rot from a home no one dared to enter. And though the family had lived decades unseen, The end came with the eerie weight of inevitability, like a prophecy long foretold. The code that had kept them alive, silence, secrecy, isolation, turned inward, suffocating what little hope remained. The children who had grown in that quiet now found themselves buried beneath it. The hollow that once kept their secrets now mourned them. Lorene's teachings were never meant to destroy them, but love twisted by fear can become something else, something that strangles rather than shelters. And so, the thread snapped. The bloodline began to fray. The thread pulled too tight until it snapped. The hills, the house, the very air seemed to exhale, as if releasing a story too heavy to hold any longer. The light in odd West Virginia has a strange quality to it, a kind of faded gold that softens the edges of what's left behind. The hills still stand the same, their silence heavy, their trees bent like old witnesses. And somewhere in that silence, behind a sagging porch and a single glowing window, the last of the Whittakers still breathe. It's been years since Lorene's hands guided that house, since her voice carried across the hollow, reminding her kin of the rules that once defined them. Yet her presence lingers, in the dust, in the faded Bible on the nightstand, in the weary rhythm of a family that never truly escaped her shadow. Betty, older now, moves through the rooms like a ghost that forgot it died. The walls remember her childhood laughter, her mother's warnings, and the unspoken sorrows that filled the air thicker than wood smoke. Outside, Ray sits on the porch, eyes lost in the trees, the same trees that once hid them from the world, and now seem to watch in judgment. Time has changed everything except the feeling, the same hush, the same ache, the same sense that the mountain is listening. The outsiders came and went. Their cameras caught faces, not stories. They left with what they could see, but the truth of the Whittakers, that stayed buried, deep beneath years of silence and shame. Some say the family's cursed. Others call them victims of poverty, of neglect, of generations that never had a chance. But maybe the truth is simpler. Maybe they were just people trying to survive the only way they knew how. In a world that forgot them, they clung to blood as if it were salvation. Now, the house stands half empty, yet still alive. Its heart beats and creaks and sighs, in the shuffle of bare feet on warped boards, in the low hum of memory that refuses to die. The past does not rest easily here. Lorene's thread still winds through every shadow, every whisper, every name carved into the wood, because every story ends, but not every silence fades. And somewhere in those hills, the bloodline still breathes. Wind swells faintly, a dog barks in the distance, fade to black.